so much. Thank you. Thank you. It is absolutely an honor to be here. In A Course in Miracles, there's a phrase that says, an idea grows stronger when it is shared. So thank you, Vishen, for having me here. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak into the listening of this particular group, because it forms the kind of pod phenomenon that is going to change this world. We know that there's something very dangerous and frightening about what happens when a bunch of people who hate get together. But it's nothing in power and force compared to what's going to happen because a bunch of people who love are now getting together. I know many of you are people that I have known, if not personally, but I've known on some energetic level, because so many of us have been reading and writing the same books, listening to the same tapes, doing the same kind of healing and transformational work that I've been involved with for the last 35 years. And we've talked about what it means to try to become the best versions of ourselves. But I think that there's a lesson to be taken here from nature. When a cell in the body becomes the best version of itself, it doesn't just stand there. It is guided through a kind of natural intelligence to where it might be best of service. Some are assigned to the pancreas, and some are assigned to the lungs, and some are assigned to the bones, some are assigned to the heart. And they are assigned in such a way that they then collaborate with other cells, so that together they serve the healthy functioning of the organ and the organism of which they are part. So the highest actualization of each cell is in its collaboration with other cells to serve something higher than them both. Now, every once in a while, a cell, for reasons that science understands to some extent, to some others' extent do not understand, a cell disconnects from its natural intelligence, and it goes off to do its own thing. It's not going to concern itself with the healthy functioning of the pancreas or the lungs or the heart. It wants to build its own kingdom, and it knows some other cells who act the same way that it does. That's called cancer. That's a malignancy. And that kind of energy is not only a malignancy in the body, it's a malignancy in consciousness. And that is what has happened to the human race. The human race has been infected with a malignant consciousness, the thought that it's all about me. That is not the spiritual mountaintop, ladies and gentlemen, that you can manifest your dreams. Adolf Hitler manifested his dreams. The high spiritual mountaintop is not just that you can have what you want, or you can have what you want, or you can have what you want. The highest spiritual mountaintop is that we can be something so much grander than what we are now. The whole point of life is not just to serve your personal goals, but to serve the ages. And it is that evolution from what do I want to what do we need. That evolution to it's just about me to it's about us forms the crux of the evolutionary movement at this point, which will determine whether or not humanity survives. You know, every single species comes to a point where if its behavior is maladaptive for its survival, it will either mutate, it will either evolve, or it will go extinct. And it's only the most magical thinking which leads any of us to believe that that doesn't apply to our species also. And yet our species is behaving in maladaptive ways. We fight too much, and we are at war against our own habitat. Now, in every species, what happens, if it does survive, is a mutation arrives. And in spiritual terms, the mutations are the great spiritual masters. The mutations are the great religious and spiritual figures who have arrived on the planet and basically demonstrated, not only expressed with their words, but demonstrated with their behavior another way. And A Course in Miracles says the change begins when we consider the possibility there might be another way. You know, many people in the transformational field have, either through our own lives or the lives of people that we love, become very sophisticated about how addiction operates, how drugs and alcohol operate. And one of the things that you know, if you've been close enough to that world, is whether it's drugs or alcohol, immoderate use, addictive use can lead to the death of the physical body. what you realize about drugs and alcohol is that the survival of the physical body is not guaranteed. It's time for us to awaken from our magical thinking. The survival of our democracy is not guaranteed, and the survival of the human race is not guaranteed either. Now, I have long felt that people who are involved in personal growth should hardly be the people who are standing on the periphery. You know, Vishen was telling me earlier that in our field of personal transformation, supposedly 49% did not vote. And didn't vote because of this idea that has been promulgated that somehow politics is too toxic and that it's not anything we should concern ourselves with. You can call that a lot of things, ladies and gentlemen, but don't call it spiritual. There's no spiritual or religious path anywhere that gives any of us a pass on addressing the suffering of other sentient beings. Not only are we the last group of people who should be standing on the sidelines, we should not only be in there, we should be the biggest grown-ups in the room. Because if you know what changes one life, you're the one who knows how to change the world. You see, politics today is part of a 20th century, increasingly obsolete relic of worldview. It's the old Newtonian paradigm where you see the world as one big machine, and so if you want to change the world, you think all you have to do is just tinker with the machine and change things on the outside. But those of us who are involved in personal growth and transformation know that if you really want to change your life, you have to do more than fix things on the outside. Because everything happening on the outside is a product of our consciousness. So if all I do is fix things on the outside, the same consequence will just turn into another iteration, another form, until I address it on the level of cause. And all that a country is, all that a planet is a group of people. So the same psychological and emotional and spiritual dynamics that prevail within the transformation of a person prevail within the transformation of a country or an entire continent or a world. And so we need to transform now. Just like in our own personal lives, you get to a point of crisis. And what do you do if you're applying personal transformational principles? Well, if you're applying personal transformational principles and you realize that you're in a crisis, you, number one, say, what was my part in this? In A Course in Miracles, it says, if you do not take 100% responsibility for your own part in your disasters, then the price you will pay for that is that you won't be able to fix them. You will not be able to solve them. And so we have to look at the part that we've played. We have to look at the part, for instance, disengagement from the political process. Disengagement from the political process just means that many of the things among us that we dislike the most were opportunistic infections. They only were able to occur because the immune system was weak. Each cell, that's what each citizen is. Citizenship is part of our spiritual path. Participating in what happens outside ourselves is part of the spiritual path. That is what it means to be deep. It means to be meaningful, and to be living a dignified and mature life means we're not just thinking about ourselves. We're not just asking, how can I live a good life? How can I live an ethical life? Which is extremely important. That's where it all begins. But then we have to ask, is this an ethical society? Is it an ethical economy? Is it a good society? Is it a genuinely good society? Now, I know many of us had been drawn into that idea that somehow, because politics was toxic, we wouldn't go there. But you know, I say all the time that our crowd, every corner of the civilization we touch transforms. Where do you think all those yoga mats come from? Us. Where do you think all that mindfulness stuff comes from? Our crowd. The only reason politics is toxic is because we haven't gone there yet. So we shouldn't be standing on the outside. We should be sending one of our guys in. Because what we know is that you have to address where you're soulless. You have to address the gap between who you say you are and how you're behaving. You have to take a fearless moral inventory. You have to address the exact nature of your own character defects. You need to atone for your mistakes. You need to make amends where appropriate. You need to really face, where am I more a promulgator of war and where am I more a promulgator of peace? And until you address these things in your own life, your life will not work. And until you address these things as a country, then no matter who is running that country, things will not work. And so we have some deep things to look at. And so many of us, if you're even at this today, this is probably not your first exposure to the principles of transformation. We're no longer living at a time where you hear someone like myself or Vishen or any of us speak and go, I've never even heard or thought of those things. That's not the moment we're living in. We're living in a moment where you come to an event like this and you find yourself saying to the person sitting next to you, isn't that interesting? He just brought that up. That's exactly what we were talking about last night. You don't come here to learn something you didn't already know. The era of data collection is over. Enough just talking about it. Right? You come here for a kind of battery charge. The real work is what's going to happen when you leave here. The real work is what's going to happen because of the aha moment you got from Marie, the aha moment you get from Lisa, the aha moment you got from Vishen, the aha moments hopefully you will get from me, and you walk out of here and you're more of a real man and you're more of a real woman. We have allowed our political and social disengagement of the personal transformational field has infantilized us. Too many of our men have behaved like little girls in the last, like little boys in the last few years. Too many. And too many of our women have behaved like little girls. Enough with coddling our trauma. Enough with coddling our tension. Enough with coddling our anxiety. We are not porcelain dolls. We are not porcelain dolls. Martin Luther King said you must have a tough mind and a tender heart. You think those people who were walking across the bridge in Selma were not traumatized? You think those women who were suffragettes who were thrown in prison because they were trying to get women the right to vote, and they went on a hunger strike because of their terrible conditions inside the prison. And so what they did was they forced their necks into these horrible metal contractions to make them eat. You think they weren't under stress? You think they weren't under anxiety? Our stresses and our anxieties and our traumas, while real, are part of the larger traumas of the society. And if we make our addressing our traumas only on the level of our personal pain, number one, we will not be able to adequately address our personal pain, but even more, we will not be doing what we came to earth to do, which is to address the larger injustices, the larger soullessness, the larger lovelessness of this planet and transform it. And until we take our part as participants in that vast transformation, we will not be deeply happy. We will not be deeply at peace. So for those of us who are Americans, there are three particular pieces where, and this is the reason why I'm running for president. I'm running for president because I feel that these things must be addressed on these deep, fierce, and authentic levels. Somebody asked me one day what my strategy is, and I didn't think they'd quite understand what I was thinking, but I thought my strategy is the Shakti that emerges when truth is fiercely and authentically spoken. But in order for that to turn into a political force, I will tell you that I need those who agree with me to join with me. I need those who agree with me to join with me, because the fields of obstruction, the ego does not say, oh, okay, and the collective ego does not say okay either. And so the political and economic status quo in this country does not really want to hear the transformational conversation that you and I are having. They don't want to put it on TV. They don't want to put it on the news shows. They don't want to really deeply include it in the conversation. But the fact that we have so many numbers and that we have so much money and that we have so much creative and manifestation capacity among us has already proven that we have changed medicine, we have changed education, we have changed business, and we're going to change the world. We stand for love, but the love that will save the world is not just a love for our children. The love that will save the world is also a love for children on the other side of town and the other side of the world. There are millions of American children who go to schools every single day in buildings that do not adequately meet safety standards, some of which don't even have functioning toilets, in schools where the classrooms are not filled with the minimum school supplies necessary to teach a child to read. Now, these children, if they do not learn how to read by the age of 8, have a drastically decreased chance of graduating from high school, and they have a drastically increased chance of incarceration. Many of these children, millions of them, live in what's called America's domestic war zones, where psychologists say they are experiencing a PTSD that is no less severe than the PTSD that is experienced by veterans returning from Afghanistan and Iraq. But a returning veteran has post-traumatic stress. These children have present traumatic stress because that stress is triggered and re-triggered every single day. Now, these children aren't old enough to vote, and so they aren't a constituency for the traditional political establishment to cater to. And they aren't old enough to work, so they don't have any financial leverage. So how can their views and their needs possibly be served? How can they possibly compete with the clout that is exercised by these huge corporate forces whose money so dominates our political system as to have turned our government into a system of legalized bribery? Now, if a person neglects a child in need, that person is called unethical at best and criminal at worst. So what do you call a whole society that is neglecting these children? And the question for us to ask as conscious people is, what does it say about me if I am saying nothing about these children? And the voice of enough of us, that is how things change. You know, when the issue of the children being separated from their parents at the border became such a big drama, and people said to people in the Trump administration, the journalist said, well, how do you ever think that you'd get away with this? And someone in the Trump administration said, we actually didn't think people would notice or people would care. You see, when people do notice and do care, we are good people. Americans are decent, dignified people, no less, no more or no less than people anywhere in the world. The issue, however, is that too many times and too chronically, we have addressed the issue of our goodness and our ethics only as it pertains to us personally and not how it pertains to the larger world. And anything that is happening to anyone, any public issue will ultimately get to your private door. If there's somebody on the other side of town suffering or someone on the other side of the world suffering because of the activities of your government, be very, very clear. These things should be seen as a canary in the coal mine. They will get to you. Good luck with all that green juice. Good luck with all that gluten-free. When they are gutting the Clean Water Act, they are gutting the Clean Air Act, and they are overturning the ban on pesticides that we absolutely know harm a child's brain. So as long as you're breathing the air and as long as you're drinking the water, all this health and wellness stuff is only going to be able to go so far. The question for us in the transformational field is, it's very nice that you want to address the symptoms of this insanity in your own life. The real issue is, are you willing to address it on the level of cause? Because if you are, you have a few things to say to chemical companies and oil companies and food companies and how the EPA operates. It's time for the American people to do what we've always done when we are at our best. And that's when we see certain things, we say as politely and kindly as possible, that shit stops now. I don't think the average American is a racist. That's not my impression at all. But I do think that the average American is vastly undereducated about the history of race in this country, particularly since the Civil War. Now, as I said before, one of the principles of personal transformation is that you have to address your own character defects. You know, just like the Catholics go to confession, and the Jews, the most holy day of the year is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. In AA, they talk about how you have to take this fearless moral inventory, address the exact nature of your character defects. America's original character defect has to do with race. This country was founded on the most extraordinarily enlightened principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, being given a God-given unalienable right. The idea that all men are created equal. The idea that governments are instituted among men to secure our rights. And yet, 41 signers of the Declaration of Independence were themselves slave owners. So that dichotomy has been with us from the beginning. It has been with us from the beginning that we aspire to the most illumined principles, but often ourselves have been the most heinous perpetrators of transgression against them. And every generation holds that dichotomy, ours no less than any other. And every generation decides for itself, what will be the basic story of this generation? Are we going to go with the aristocratic paradigm? Are we going to go with the idea that only a few people should be free? Only a few people should be entitled? Only a few people, as the aristocratic system that this country was founded to repudiate, was a system in which only a few people could own land. Only a few people were entitled to wealth. Only a few people were entitled to education. Only a few people were entitled to materialize their dreams. And the entire idea of the American dream is that we should not cap anybody's dreams, that everybody should have a chance to soar. Everybody. And starting from the very beginning, that dichotomy between these high principles, the angels of our better nature, and what amounts to the demons of our inner nature, has been centered around the issue of race. Now, we abolished slavery. And it took another 100 years after the abolition of slavery to abolish institutionalized white supremacy and then segregation in the American South. And in the 1960s, we did dismantle the mechanisms of segregation, and we did pass a Voting Rights Act to ensure that Black people would have equal access to voting in America. Ladies and gentlemen, just like in any other relationship, in many ways, we've now slid backwards. In 2013, our Supreme Court began to gut the Voting Rights Act, which is exactly why we have all these voting suppression efforts all over this country, and we know who they're basically aimed at. Mass incarceration also means we have slid backwards. Criminal sentencing, racial disparity in our criminal sentencing is another sign that we have slid backwards. What do you do in your personal life when you face these things? You fix it, you atone, you make amends. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to pay reparations for slavery. It's time. At the end of the Civil War, General Tecumseh Sherman promised to every family of 4 of the enslaved population 40 acres and a mule. And we hear this phrase, but when you think about what that means, you had been a slave. You certainly had a skill set. You were out there working, but you were forced labor. With 40 acres and a mule, you would have a chance to start your life over. You would have a chance to go out there and do it for yourself. In most of the cases, that 40 acres was never given, and when it was given, most of the time it was then taken away. And so that formerly enslaved population never had a chance to get a foothold in the U.S. economy compared to whites. And so what has happened since 1865 is the gap has never been closed because of racial prejudice that has been included and perpetuated in our economic and social systems. You know, abolishing slavery, and the Emancipation Proclamation, these are external remedies. We know how these things work. They could abolish institutions, but they could not abolish racism. And so racism being the ultimate disease, it has simply reformed itself. So it's simply time for us to take the next step in this healing relationship. When you had 2.5 centuries of slavery, and then you had another century of institutionalized violence against a certain population, then you simply take the next step. Germany has paid $89 billion in reparations to Jewish organizations since World War II. And the United States in 1988, Ronald Reagan passed the American Civil Liberties Act, whereby people who had been interned in the Japanese internment camps during World War II, the surviving people who had been prisoners were then given anywhere between 20,000 and 22,000. We could have a plan of reparations where, for the sake of projects of economic and educational renewal, America did the right thing. You know, it's interesting, ladies and gentlemen, many people in our community have talked about random acts of kindness. Well, I would like to submit to you, random acts of kindness are not enough right now. We need huge, strategized acts of doing the right thing. There is someone among us who has harnessed fear for political purposes, and we must now harness love for political purposes. That is our task. There are many more people who love than hate in this country and in this world. But the problem is that those who hate, hate with conviction. Those who hate are strategic. Those who hate are organized. Those who hate are really serious about getting this done. What is needed is not more numbers of those who love. What's needed is some spine among those who love. We need to be strategic around our love now. We need to be convicted around our love now. And one of the last things that's so important for us to look at in order to get this done is to realize it's not just enough to just prepare for war. You have to wage peace. Our national defense strategy has nothing to do with planning peace in the next 50 years or 100 years. You can't just fight sickness, you have to cultivate health. That's the type of thing we realize. And so people in the transformational field are the ones who would understand you can't just be prepared to fight a war. We must be prepared to fight a war. I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm not saying we shouldn't have a very powerful military. We have respect for the military. This is not their decision-making that we're talking about here. If you're going to have surgery, you want to have the best surgeon, but you want to avoid surgery if that's possible. Right now, for every dollar we spend on real peace creation, we spend over $1,000 on preparing for war. You don't create peace just by buying more military equipment. You prepare for peace by expanding educational opportunities for children around the world, expanding economic opportunities for women around the world, decreasing violence against women around the world, and ameliorating human suffering wherever possible. Ladies and gentlemen, desperate people, large groups of desperate people should be seen as a national security risk. We of all people understand what despair does. We understand what pain does. We understand what anxiety does. Large groups of desperate people do desperate things. Large groups of desperate people are more vulnerable to ideological capture by genuinely psychotic forces. So it doesn't matter how much military power you have, ladies and gentlemen, if there's enough pain in enough people's hearts, and if enough of those people think you're the cause of it, then God help us. We understand these things, don't we? Because we understand that it's not just about what happens in Washington, it's about what happens in us. We need a politics that does not just address this narrow view of things where we think it's all about data, it's all about hard power, it's all about brute force, it's all about numbers. No, it's not really. It's about what people's experience is that will then determine how they act, how they behave. And when we in our personal lives behave with love and try to do the right thing and try to help people and do well, and even in this crowd we have to look at that. I want to remind everybody in the personal transformation field, Jesus did not come to the earth to say, love yourself. It's not just about love yourself, it's love each other. Buddha was not just about love myself, it was love and compassion for all sentient beings. It can't just stay in here, and it can't just stay in our tribe, and it can't just stay in our ethnic group, our religion, our color, our sex, our sexuality, or even our corner of the culture. We have to now expand our love. And as we do, miracles happen, because miracles always happen when love is present. And so it's time for a politics that is integrative, just like we helped usher in a medical model, a health and wellness model that's integrative. It's whole person. It's not just two-dimensional and black and white. It's multidimensional, and it has so much color in it. It has so many dimensions in it. It's what happens when people wake up. That is what will determine what happens in our country and in our world in the 21st century. It will not be politics as a spectator sport, where a bunch of people who are just trying to organize things according to an economic model that should stay in the 20th century. It's like when you grow up and you realize, how did my parents behave? And then you go, they did it well. Where they did it well, I want to do it even better. And where they did it bad, I'm going to break that chain, so I'm not going to take that into the life of my kids. For people who are not even living the majority of their lives in the 21st century, and many of whom aren't living any of their lives in the 20th century, should not be burdened by the old, obsolete, inaccurate, inadequate thinking of the 21st century, of the 20th century. It is the 21st century. We in the health and wellness community have helped usher in the enlightened constructs that have already transformed business, that have already transformed medicine, that have already transformed education, that have already transformed science, and for all of us here have already, when we have applied those principles, transformed our lives. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll help me. Let's transform America and transform this world. Thank you very, very, very much. Thank you. Thank you very, very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.